This afternoon's session of the Levelling Up Housing and Communities Select Committee. This afternoon we're going to have a session with the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman to look at the triennial review that the Ombudsman does and also look at other relevant issues to do with the work of the Ombudsman. And we have, of course, the Ombudsman with us this afternoon to answer questions. Perhaps I could just hand over and ask you to introduce yourself, but before I do that, I'll just ask members of the committee to put on record any particular interests they may have that are relevant to this inquiry. I'm a Vice President of the Local Government Association. I'll just go round the table, members, just to put on record any interests they have.
I'm a member of Bedford Town Deal Board.
Right.
I'm a Vice President of the Local Government Association and I employ a councillor in my office.
I'm still a serving councillor on Liverpool City Council and I employ a councillor in my office.
I'm also a member of the Local Government Association, Vice President.
I'm Vice President of the Local Government Association and I employ a councillor in my office.
I employ councillors in my office, Chair. I employ a councillor in my staff team.
I'm a Vice Chair of the LGA, Chairman, and on the Northampton Forward Board.
Right, okay, thanks for that. Ombudsman, over to you.
Yeah, my name's Michael King. I'm the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman, and I have been since 2017. I'm also the Chairman of the Commission for Local Administration, which is the governing board of the Ombudsman scheme.
Okay, and thank you for coming this afternoon to answer our questions. Very obviously, COVID has had a major impact on local government and indeed on your work as well, because you had to suspend dealing with complaints that came to you for a time because of the COVID impact. So could you just tell us what impact it's had on your work and what steps you've taken to ensure that those people whose cases were perhaps held on one side during the initial period of the pandemic have actually received an appropriate service since?
Yes, certainly. As you've said, when the pandemic first arrived in the UK, we were approached by the Local Government Association and also by many individual local authorities who were saying that they simply couldn't respond to our requests in the normal way in that very first early phase of the outbreak. So we took the unprecedented decision to suspend our normal work, and we did that for 3 months. During that time, we progressed any cases we could, and we did lots of other work in the background, but our normal process of investigating was suspended. Now, we've never done that before in the 47 years we've been in existence, so that was very unusual. The guarantee we gave, though, was that nobody would be disadvantaged by that, and anybody who had a complaint could come to us when we reopened. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. When we resumed in June 2020, we had a huge influx of cases, and our unallocated cases rose by 172%. Then, so people who had effectively been delayed coming to us, but nobody was denied the ability to make a complaint. In terms of our own operations, we obviously had to make our transition as well, where our own staff had to work from home. Actually, that was relatively straightforward for us. Our IT teams and facilities people did a great job, and our staff were able to move quite smoothly to work from home. Having said that, though, I think throughout the crisis, we've probably only been working on about 80% of our normal capacity. We've got lots of staff with young families, so they've been affected by the same problems as anyone else in terms of homeschooling and looking after children at home. But I think also one of the things that's affected us is that to do the job that we do, I think staff need to be able to communicate with each other, they need to support each other, they need to share knowledge. And working in isolation, I think it's had quite a negative effect on that aspect of our job. So significant increase in complaints when we resumed work, and some of the kind of challenges that every organisation's had in terms of the capacity to deal with that. But overall, I think we've been able to work very closely with local authorities to make sure that we've kept the complaints process running as well as it possibly can. And certainly since we resumed in June, it's been pretty much business as usual in terms of dealing with normal complaints and investigations.
But clearly you had a backlog. How have you been dealing with that? Are you, you say you're back to dealing with cases as they come in, but are you back to dealing with things in a similar time frame now?
No, we're not. I mean, that's the one area of concern I've got about our work at the moment, that 172% increase in complaints that came in after the pandemic. We've really struggled to get on top of that, so much so that last summer we launched a plan internally to reduce waiting times for unallocated cases. Currently, they're probably about double where they would normally be. Obviously, at any point in time, you have a number of cases just in hand as you progress those. So we've got a target to have about 650 cases in that process at any one time. At the moment, we've got about 1,500, so it's more than where we're comfortable for it to be. So in July last year, we've launched a sustainable casework program, which is a plan to get on top of that. That's proven to be remarkably effective. It's various changes in our process, not least of all looking at making sure that we focus on the right complaints we want to investigate at the very start of the process. That's already showing a sustained reduction in the number of unallocated cases, and we're confident that within the next few months, that's going to bring the number of unallocated cases back down to the kind of normal frictional levels that we would hope for. So that has been a challenge for us, particularly with continued pressure on staff capacity. But as I say, we've got a plan to deal with that, and I'm confident that we are, well, have forecasts which show that we're on track to deal with that in the way I would hope.
Will you continue with those change processes in the future? And does that mean that cases will be resolved more quickly in the future?
Well, actually, interestingly, the time, once our staff get hold of the complaints, our times are actually holding up reasonably well. We're hitting all of our time targets at the moment. So 99% of our cases are dealt with in 52 weeks, 87% of them within 26 weeks. So our time targets are pretty good. Our quality thresholds we're hitting as well. And so really the problem we've got is simply about trying to eliminate the queue time that people have to come into the system. As I say, that's coming down quite rapidly at the moment.
Okay, right. In terms of complaints processes, including those within councils, Brendan Clark-Smith wants to explore that. Brendan.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, Mr. King. I was looking at your triennial review, and one of the proposals there is about being able to investigate cases where the complainant has not suffered a personal injustice. Why is it that this change, why do you feel it's important particularly, and how do you anticipate that this would potentially affect your workload?
Well, it's a really interesting question. Thank you for it. I mean, at the moment, the situation is that when somebody wants to make a complaint to us, they have to satisfy a requirement that dates from the 1970s, that not only have they got a legitimate concern about some aspect of local government administration, but they also have to show that that concern has had a direct impact on them and has caused them some harm or loss. So it's quite a sort of old-fashioned transactional view that the only things that you would care about are the things that have directly affected you personally. And it's something that causes us a problem, and that lots of people come to us, including people being referred by MPs' constituency officers, where they want to complain about something that affects their community, they want to complain about something that affects their neighbourhood or their neighbours. And you know, these are all legitimate complaints, absolutely the mainstream of what we would normally investigate. But we have to turn around to those people and say that we can't investigate them because of this qualifying criteria from the 1970s in our legislation. So some examples of the type of complaints I'm talking about. Recently, I can recall one where we had the chair of school governors coming to us, want to complain about really poor support for somebody with special educational needs in her school. We couldn't look at that because they weren't directly affected. We have, I can recall another one where an MP's office came to us about concerns about loss of planning control over a traveller's site adjacent to a village. And again, we could only look at parts of that complaint because people couldn't show that they were directly suffering some loss. Similarly, we get complaints about things like loss of community assets and open space. So there's a whole range of complaints which people think we can investigate, and they're absolutely in the mainstream of what we do investigate. But because of the 1970s construction of our legislation, they're prevented from doing so a lot of the time. So we think it would be much more sensible if people could complain about those issues and we can investigate them without necessarily them having to show that they'd suffered some direct loss themselves.
Thank you. And just following on from that, you've been working with the Housing Ombudsman on a joint code for your complaint handling. Just particularly with that, how do you envisage that code potentially enhancing your work and your cooperation with the Housing Ombudsman?
Well, we have a very close working relationship with the Housing Ombudsman, and one of the things that they've done recently, both of our organisations have been given advice to local authorities for a long time about how to run effective complaint systems. What the Housing Ombudsman's done, though, is taken the kind of principles that we both apply and really taken those to another level with a much more developed code around the way in which both landlords and local authorities should deal with complaints. That's had a really, really positive effect. I mean, when I talk to people in local government, they say that senior managers there are taking housing complaints far more seriously than they've ever done before. It's a direct result of the Housing Ombudsman's code. That code has also got some new dimensions to it. So, for example, it encourages local authorities to do a self-assessment against the code to see how they're performing. And it also has a system whereby if local authorities are found to be in breach of the code multiple times, the Ombudsman can issue a complaint failure order, so giving some transparency about those who aren't living up to those expectations. So it's been a huge success, the Housing Ombudsman's code, and frankly, we think we should probably emulate that and do something similar. But I think both me and the Housing Ombudsman are conscious that we both talk to local government about complaints, we're both talking to the same teams in local government, so we feel there's a kind of moral imperative for us to make sure that we're speaking with one voice and that we're consistent in what we're asking of local authorities. So our plan is to try and converge onto a single complaints code for local government based on the tried and tested model the Housing Ombudsman's got, to try and get some greater consistency and raise the standard of complaint handling in local authorities.
Thank you. And finally, the Public Service Ombudsman in Wales and Northern Ireland particularly have powers to investigate issues on their own initiative without having to require that complaint in the first instance from a member of the public. Would you say that these powers you'd like to have? Is there something you would support?
It is. I mean, in our Triennial review, we're specifically proposing that we should have the power to launch proactive investigations in relation to adult social care providers. And we're specifically calling for it there, because where these powers are traditionally used is in areas where you know there are problems, but actually people wouldn't be able to complain. So in adult social care, people who lack capacity or who are, in residential care, their ability to complain is much more restricted. So in that kind of setting, potentially the power for us to launch a proactive investigation into areas of concern could be really valuable. And certainly this is a power that's well established. As you say, the Welsh Ombudsman's got that power, recently done a really interesting investigation into the way in which homelessness has been dealt with by local authorities in Wales. Northern Ireland Ombudsman's got this. It's also been a feature of ombudsman practice in places like Canada and Australia for many, many years. And it's something which is, in most of the rest of the world, seen as just a normal part of an ombudsman's operations. So yeah, specifically in relation to social care, it's something we would welcome.
Thank you. Thank
you. Mary, you've got a follow-up question. Mary Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. I just follow up, and declaring an interest, I'm Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Whistleblowing, and so I'm interested in how you would deal with those complaints. You referred to earlier the difficulties that you have because you can only deal with certain quite strict criteria. So how you would deal with a complaint which is obviously a whistleblowing complaint. Presumably you're a prescribed person under the Public Interest Disclosure Act, and just what would you do with a complaint that you would like to take on, but you know that you can't because it's outside your remit, and how comfortable you feel about perhaps having to just refer it back to the local authority or wherever the complaint arises?
So again, a really interesting question. Actually, the interesting thing is we're not a prescribed person under the visa regulations. So when we get a whistleblowing disclosure, normally what we're doing is looking to refer that to one of the named bodies. So typically we might refer that to the Care Quality Commission or Ofsted or one of the regulatory bodies. And I think it's important that the proposals we've got in our training review, we're not trying to step into the role that other people have. So I know one of the areas which might give rise to some concern are some of our proposals taking us towards being a regulatory body or a whistleblowing handler. Actually, all of the proposals we've got in our training review are very much about trying to do the job we were always intended to do, but do it in a modern context. So it's really about trying to update and refresh our existing role rather than trespass onto the role of other bodies. So probably in terms of classical whistleblowing, it's probably not the area that we would be looking to move into. We tend to try and work in partnership with others to make sure those concerns are addressed properly.
Just a quick follow-up. As part of your streamlined complaints handling procedure, have you got specific training in dealing with those whistleblowing and how to pass them on?
We've got specific policies within the organisation about how to deal with whistleblowing. We've got guidance for our staff on how to deal with those complaints and where they should go, and references to where the most appropriate body would be, where we get one of those disclosures. I mean, interestingly, we've already mentioned the role of other UK Ombudsmen. In Scotland, they've taken on the role of being the body who deal with NHS whistleblowing complaints. So, you know, there is a scope for Ombudsmen to take on that role, but I think, as in Scotland, that's a very specific piece of legislation that's brought them into play to deal with that.
Thank you.
Thanks. Moving on now to the issue of the focus reports, which I think one of the welcome innovations from the Ombudsman in the last few years. Mohammed Yassin.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, Mr. King. You have published focus reports on subjects such as domestic abuse and children's services. So looking across these different reports, in your view, what lessons are there which local councils need to learn?
Thank you. I mean, we've issued 3 focus reports in the last 12 months. One of them is about lessons local authorities can learn around domestic violence in anticipation of the new duties that local authorities are going to get. One was about looking at our first 50 investigations into the Homelessness Reduction Act to see how local authorities had implemented the new legislation and what they'd learned. And then the third one of our focus reports was about looked after children, and again trying to see where we've seen patterns of problems that local authorities can learn on. Now, they're 3 very, very diverse topics, but the intent behind all of those focus reports is exactly the same. What we try and do is look at what are the key insights and learning that we could take from what we've investigated, and how can we feed those back to local authorities so that they can learn and improve and avoid the repetition of the same mistakes. And this is really fundamental to my view of what we should be doing. I mean, if all we ever do is resolve individual complaints, then that's not really a very effective service. So what we try and do is extract the learning from what might have been a terrible experience for one individual person, make sure that that's learned more widely by the local authority. So in each of those focus reports, as well as individual case studies which perhaps highlight areas that local authorities can learn from, there's also a list of best practice suggestions for local authorities to consider. And I'm also absolutely intent on making sure that there's democratic engagement with these kind of reports. So in every report in the last few years, we've got a section in the back aimed at local authority elected members, so that through their internal scrutiny processes, we provide them with suggested questions they can ask to hold the officers in their authority to account and to try and probe whether the authority is learning lessons from complaints and is mimicking best practice. And we know that they're widely used by local authorities. We did a survey earlier this year to ask local authorities what sort of actions they take as a result of our work. And 91% of councils said that they had improved services as a result of our investigations. So that was really heartening. We also know specific examples where authorities have taken action off the back of these focus reports. So a couple of years ago, we did a report about special guardianship orders. And we pointed out that in many cases, local authorities were not providing the support they should to special guardians. We know a number of authorities changed their policies proactively as a result of that report. And I know of at least one authority who took it upon themselves to identify families who'd been underfunded as a result of their previous policy. And they actually provided backdated support and payments to those families to make sure that they rectified the problems they've got. So we know from experience that these reports have quite a significant effect. But they're very practically focused. I think that's the key thing about them. It's not top-down regulation. This is very much about trying to use real-world experiences that people have had to try and inform practical suggestions and improvements for local authorities.
And your report into the implementation of Homelessness Reduction Act was based on the cases before COVID-19 pandemic. Do you think are there any changes in the situation since then?
Well, interestingly, during the COVID outbreak, despite the everyone in policy, we did actually investigate some homelessness cases during the pandemic. And in one instance, we found a case where a mother and her teenage son were actually evicted from temporary accommodation during the pandemic, during the very first phase of it, and ended up sleeping in a tent during the first phase of the pandemic because they've been wrongly evicted by the local authority. And they weren't protected under the COVID protections because they were living in the property under license rather than being a tenant, so they didn't have any of the normal protections. So there was lessons to be learned even during the pandemic around treatment of homelessness. What we've seen subsequently, and obviously we're keeping a very close eye on this, that our real concern is that once some of the protections that were in place during COVID are lifted, that there might be a significant increase in problems with homelessness. So we're monitoring that very carefully. We haven't seen that yet in terms of the numbers of complaints coming to us, but often there's a little bit of a delay while they're dealt with in local authorities first. What I would say, though, is we've looked at the level of fault we've found with homelessness over the last few years, and actually, sadly, it's risen every year, and it was in excess of 80% of cases that we looked at where we were finding fault in the last year. So there's clearly some significant problems still in the way in which some local authorities are implementing their new duties and understanding them. Many of the problems we found, though, were fairly straightforward administrative problems around delay, around communication, and around following the guidance. So these aren't insurmountable problems, but they are ones which just require attention to detail in terms of implementing the requirements of the new Act.
Thank you very much.
Yes, Bob.
Yeah, can I just follow up on the Homelessness Reduction Act, as I have a little bit of interest in it. You, in your report, obviously, one of the things you allude to is the personal housing plans, which are obviously intended to be implemented as soon as someone's assessed, so that actually no one becomes homeless at all, because they'll have followed the housing plan. And you've commented, I think, adversely that a lot of authorities don't do that properly. Anecdotally, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that a lot of local authorities still wait for someone to become homeless before they actually address the fact that they are going to become homeless. And I wonder if you've seen cases like that. And the second issue, which I just want to pick up on, is that during the pandemic, I think Shelter had produced quite a lot of evidence of people that have been basically turned away. Obviously, if they're homeless, their ability to complain to an ombudsman or anyone else is severely limited. And I wonder if you've seen any cases at all coming in of that type that you can examine and take forward.
In terms of the first scenario you talk about in terms of local authorities not understanding the housing plans properly, absolutely we've seen cases like that where either people weren't provided with taken through the proper stages of the planning process at the appropriate time. We've also seen cases where those plans were not reviewed and updated as somebody's circumstances changed. Some of that I think was due to, we've seen problems where the housing teams perhaps didn't understand. The cases we were looking at, I should say, were all pre-COVID, so they're some time ago now, but some of them didn't understand the new concepts and they weren't applying them properly. In other cases, it was attributed by the authority to a lack of resource and pressures on the team. I think what we need to do...
Can I just interrupt? On the cases where people had not had not implemented processes because they didn't understand them, the guidance given by the ministry is huge and very comprehensive. So was it a case that people hadn't been trained, or was it just a case of they were ignoring the rules?
I think, well, as I say, the cases we were looking at were, I suppose, in the reasonably early stages of this. So I think what we saw was some authorities not fully understanding the changes in what was expected of them. Now, I agree with the implication of your question that shouldn't be the case at that point. I mean, the new legislation was very clear in its intent and introduced a very clear new process. And we would absolutely expect local authorities to be following that from day one. It wasn't, none of it was a surprise, and there was plenty of guidance to support that. So, I mean, our view is that local authorities should understand these processes, and they should be implementing them, and they should be putting sufficient resources into their teams to enable people to do that job properly. So it's something that we will return to, and as I say, we're going to be keeping a very close eye on trends in homelessness complaints in the coming period. I'm sorry, the second part of your question?
Well, anecdotally, Shelter have produced evidence to suggest that a lot of people are being turned away by local authorities at the moment. Clearly, people that are homeless find it quite difficult to complain to anyone, but let alone put a complaint to you. But I wonder if you've seen any cases such as that in the recent past.
I can't recall any in the recent past like that, but I mean, I think the scenario is one which is familiar across various parts of our jurisdiction. It goes back to the previous question about the need to have powers to expand our investigations or launch investigations into areas where we know, perhaps through bodies like Shelter, that there are problems, but those people are unlikely to come to us. So I think one of the reasons why the Welsh Ombudsman launched this proactive investigation into housing complaints was for exactly that reason, that they were aware of concerns, but they were also aware that the number of homeless people who were able to come to them and articulate their complaint was actually very, very few. So that was a classic example where being able to step in proactively and look was very much appropriate to the circumstances.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, moving on now to local authority complaints, procedures and resources. Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Chair. In your review of local government complaints, you commented that you were concerned about the general erosion to the visibility, capacity and status of complaint functions within councils, and that these concerns are not new and cannot be wholly attributed to the trials of the pandemic. So could I surmise that you were alluding to the fact that it's as a result of significant funding reductions in local authorities? Would that be fair to say?
I think my concerns, they certainly predate COVID, and my concerns are really partly that local authority complaints functions in some authorities are under-resourced, for sure, but also I think that in some authorities the status and importance of listening to public concerns has become marginalised. I started working in local government back in the 1980s, and at that time listening to the public and listening to public concerns was absolutely fundamental to the way in which local authorities worked. It was the days of the Citizens' Charter. That kind of culture carried on all the way through the 90s. My concern is that I think there's been an erosion of that culture. I see some authorities where complaint handling is seen as a kind of nice to have customer service issue, pushed to the margins. And I see, what we've seen through COVID is that those areas of local authorities that were already under pressure, including complaint handling, are the ones which haven't fared very well. So a number of the complaints we've looked at during the COVID outbreak, we've seen those authorities who haven't invested in their complaint systems, maybe seconded staff away or simply didn't have enough staff in the first place. Their complaint systems have not fared well during the crisis. I can think of one complaint in particular that I'm familiar with where a woman had died in a residential care home of COVID, a care home commissioned by the local authority. Her family complained to the council about the standards of care in that home. There was allegations of inappropriate and failing to use PPE, staff wearing masks around their neck, staff misleading the family about what was going on. So some very, very serious concerns that should have been addressed in the moment and could have contained important learning. The local authority, after 14 months, still hadn't provided a response to that complaint. And we've seen that in a number of authorities, other authorities who completely abandoned the children's statutory complaints process when there was no lawful basis to do so, simply because it was just too onerous for them to administer during the crisis. So these things aren't new, they weren't created by COVID, but there are some authorities who simply, I think, have taken their eye off the ball in terms of complaint handling. I should say, though, that there are some authorities who do it very well. They're exemplars of learning from complaints. They put it at the heart of their corporate governance, and they see it as a way of getting free intelligence to improve their services. So there's some councils who are absolutely excellent at complaint handling and embody the kind of culture that I would want to see. Unfortunately, though, there are others who, as I say, I think have pushed it to the margins and don't recognise the significance of it.
Thanks for that. And so, building on what you've just said, what measures are needed to sort of really address your concerns about complaint handling?
Well, partly the work we talked about earlier in the session around the work we're going to do jointly with the Housing Ombudsman to have a consistent code and to make sure that's got some teeth in terms of making sure that local authorities who don't comply with it are held to account publicly, but also making sure that there's some expectation that councils will self-assess to determine that they're meeting that standard. In Scotland and in other parts of the UK, the Ombudsman has what's called a statutory complaint standards function. So there, the Ombudsman can actually set the standards, mandatory standards for complaint handling. They can set standards for data reporting. And that's been a hugely successful approach. So I suppose what I'd be saying about complaint systems is I'm very happy to try and work on a voluntary basis with the sector to try and improve complaint handling. But I think if that doesn't work and there isn't the will in local authorities to try and consistently improve complaint handling, then I think it would be appropriate to consider whether we need to move to a statutory footing. And certainly in social care, we've got a much more diverse provider market. We are calling there that we should be a mandatory complaint standards authority, so we can set proper standards for complaint handling across the independent social care sector.
Thanks. And just talking about resources and your Ombudsman, do you think that as the Ombudsman, your organisation has sufficient resources for both the current functions and any increased role that you want it to have?
Certainly in terms of any increased role, we would need to have fresh resources for any of the kind of proposals we've got to clarify and extend our role. In terms of whether we have enough resources at the moment, the frank answer is no. Between 2011 and 2019, we lost 41% of our funding. We were already the lowest cost ombudsman in the UK at that time, and that had a huge effect on our work. We're proud of what we've done to try and address that. I mean, we've completely restructured the way we work. We had a 30% increase in our productivity. We moved our head office out of London to Coventry. We saved lots of money on accommodation. So we've taken huge strides to try and deal with that. But actually, to have that amount of funding taken out is very difficult. And in purely cash terms, we've still only got 3/4 of the amount of money we had a decade ago to try and run the job. So we operate with a degree of risk because of that. I mean, I would compliment our staff on the extent to which they work hard to try and make sure that we can keep the process running. But, for example, only 7% of our money is spent on corporate functions. So things like IT, HR, finance, where other organisations of our scale would have a whole team of people dealing with these, we've got 1 or 2 people. We can't afford an in-house legal function, for example. So there are some real risks and some real pressures from operating on the level of funding we've got. And when you compare our resources with those of our sister organisations in other parts of the UK or other ombudsman schemes, we've become a real outlier. We are by far and away the lowest funded ombudsman scheme in the UK. As I say, that comes at a cost. For example, in terms of outreach, we've got no capacity whatsoever to actually go and tell people about the work we do and to try and raise awareness, even though we know that lots of people aren't aware of our role. So under the current comprehensive spending review, we have put in a submission to government to ask for a modest increase in our funding, equivalent to about a 6% increase, which would effectively give us another team of people to do some more complaints. But nevertheless, I mean, the basis upon which we operate is a very, very thin budget, unfortunately.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Mary, you've got a follow-up.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up with regards to complaint handling and the disparities between different, let's say, local authorities. It could be indicative if a local authority doesn't want to have an efficient and effective complaints handling procedure in place, that they are actually not doing other things in the right way, and it's in their best interest not to have those complaints properly handled. How do you feed into, let's say, the local authority audit function and the outside external audit of local authorities, and what weight should or is given to your findings?
First of all, the underlying point that you're making there is a really important one, because what we've found is, exactly as you've said, those authorities who aren't keen to listen to public concerns and who don't learn from mistakes that they've made, there's a very strong triangulation between that and authorities who have other problems. So, for example, we were all aware, I'm sure, of some of the problems with Northamptonshire County Council a few years ago. Actually, for 3 years before those problems became manifest in public, we were raising concerns about the authority, not just about individual complaints. but about a culture we could see at that authority where they weren't prepared to listen to junior staff who were raising concerns as a result of complaints, and our own findings weren't being taken seriously by the authorities. Sometimes they would agree to implement a change and then just completely fail to do that. So there's a very, very strong correlation between authorities who fail to take complaints seriously and have poor corporate governance. I mean, for me, listening to public concerns in a democratic body is absolutely central to your corporate governance. If you don't do that, then that rings other alarm bells. So I think there is a strong case to be made that this is almost a warning sign for wider concerns about authority, and we've seen that in a number of cases. In terms of the link to local audit, and we had a meeting last year with the NAO. They were revising the codes for local audit, and we were picked up exactly this point to suggest that actually external auditors should take more account of some of our findings about a local authority, not just because they may have a material, financial or reputational risk to the authority, but actually they could be the canary in the coal mine signalling wider problems with that authority. So I'm hoping that in future that external audit will take more account of some of the concerns that we've raised.
Right. Moving on to your jurisdiction now, the housing matters, Benevert.
Thank you. So many of the areas that you mentioned in last year's Triennial review were where you wanted to expand your remit, but they repeat proposals that you made in 2008 and in 2015. Why do you think those proposals, when you made them then, were rejected, and what makes you think that you'll have more success next time?
The proposals around gaps in housing, I think they probably haven't progressed because the gaps which have been created, I think, were an inadvertent byproduct of changes from the 2011 Localism Act. What happened was that there's certain types of people who can't complain either to myself or to the Housing Ombudsman. So a good example of that is if you are an owner-occupier and you live on an estate that's managed through the council's housing management functions, you've got a complaint, say, about water ingress from a neighbouring property, infestation of a neighbouring property, you can't go to the Housing Ombudsman because you don't have a tenancy relationship with the council. You can't come to us because complaints about housing management are excluded from our jurisdiction. So what you've got is a technical problem, which I don't think anybody intended to create, but by which there are a small but important group of people who can no longer complain about day-to-day problems. And every year we get complaints from those people. I can recall one in the not too distant past where somebody complained to us that the council had repeatedly entered their property in order to observe problems with tenants next door without any permission from the person who's actually an owner-occupier on that estate. And they have got absolutely nowhere to turn. They can't complain to me and they can't complain to the Housing Ombudsman. So although this is a kind of a technical gap, our proposals around that are that it would be relatively straightforward if there is some other legislation about housing changes to actually just put a couple of clauses in the back of that bill in order to try and just rectify this lacuna that's developed, which, as I say, I don't think there was no political intent to create that, but some people have lost out inadvertently. So hopefully that's something which could be picked up relatively quickly and relatively straightforwardly in another piece of legislation.
So you're saying it's not necessarily that there's been policy changes or regulatory changes since those other two attempts, it's more that there's a better opportunity this time, given what's on the agenda?
I think it's simply a case of finding appropriate parliamentary time and opportunity to try and make that change. So I would be optimistic and hopeful that we can do that at some point, yes.
Right. Thank you.
Just moving on to education, looking at potential gaps there in your remit. Ian Byrne.
Thanks, Chair. And thanks very much, Michael. It's been an excellent session so far, really good. You called in your 2018-2021 Triennial reviews for you to be given power over admissions and expulsions to academies and free schools. However, since 1988, the government has repeatedly rejected your oversight of directly funded schools. Can you explain why you think you should have oversight of such schools, and why your request for these additional powers consistently refused by the government of the day?
Thank you. There's three areas that we're proposing would be useful to be renewed and refreshed in terms of our education remit. So if I can briefly just set out what those three are. The first two are areas where we used to have jurisdiction to look at things, but we don't anymore. So in terms of schools complaints as a whole, it's interesting that schools are one of the only services, one of the only significant services in this country where you don't have a right to go to an independent body to make a complaint. But in this country, you've got an ombudsman for everything from funerals to furniture, but you can't go to an ombudsman about what goes on in your child's education, which seems to me to be one of the main gaps in public accountability in this country. Back in 2009, we ran a pilot jurisdiction with the Department for Education, where in 14 local authority areas of the country, we had the power to look at complaints about day-to-day matters within schools. That was a hugely successful pilot, and it was something we could have expanded to. We demonstrated it was possible to run a scheme where parents and pupils would have the ability to complain about matters that hadn't been resolved by heads and governors, and they could come to us for everything from bullying to other kind of issues that were going on in schools. Unfortunately, due to political changes subsequently, that never progressed, and that pilot scheme finished. It was evaluated, seemed to be a success, but it's never progressed. So the first thing that we're saying in terms of education is that pilot, I think, should be resurrected, and that we should be able to look at complaints from parents and pupils about what goes on in the school. That's already the case in Northern Ireland, and my opposite number in Northern Ireland routinely now looks at complaints about schools. She does that entirely successfully, and she's had some huge success looking at some particular problem areas. So recently did a major report around unlawful restraint of pupils in schools, and I know that was widely welcomed by politicians in Northern Ireland as an important investigation. So this is a tried and tested thing, both in terms of what we've done previously in England and our colleagues in Northern Ireland. So that's the big picture that we would like to see changed. The other two areas where I think there should be change is when we look at complaints about special educational needs, we can look at every part of that process other than what goes on in the school. So we can look at the delays in the development of a plan for a child with special educational needs. We can look at the delivery of that plan and whether it's done properly. We can look at the council's oversight of that entire process. But what we can't look at is whether the school's done its bit, whether the school is providing appropriate support. And that just seems perverse. So often a parent will come to us and we'll say, we can look at the whole of this story about your child's support, but not that bit. And the bit that, we've got to stop at the school gate and we can't look at that part. And quite rightly, parents say to us, this is madness. Why can't you look at those kind of parts of the process? So that's the second part. We think that we should be able to look at special education needs support by schools within the school gate. And actually, I know one of the concerns that's been expressed in some quarters is the number of pupils who end up with education, health and care plans. Well, actually, I think if we were able to look at the general special educational needs support that was given in schools upstream of those plans, we might actually be able to help explore why so many of those support services are failing, the result the parents have to go for a plan. So it might actually save resources in the system if we were able to do that. The third area, we used to be able to look at school admissions and school expulsions decisions. And every spring, we would look at thousands of complaints from parents about the process by which their children could get allocated to a school place. That was a hugely successful piece of our work and often resolved all sorts of problems and malpractice around school admissions. What's happened subsequently, though, is as the growth of academies and free schools, they're excluded from our jurisdiction. So we now have parents come into us to say, I'd like to complain about the process about my child applying for a school place. We have to say to them, well, we can look at the maintained school you applied for, but we can't look at the academy you applied for. So again, understandably, parents are left scratching their heads wondering why we are so bureaucratic and why we can't look at both. So our argument there is we should be able to look at any type of school so that we can give parents a joined-up service. In terms of the final part of your question about why has this not progressed, I think partly there's maybe a misunderstanding that we are saying that we should be able to look at these education matters because we're associated with local government and we want to look at these through the lens of local government. We're not saying that at all. We're not trying to artificially create a link between our local government jurisdiction and education. What we're saying is that education in its own right should be subject to the same kind of independent scrutiny as health, social care, local government, and that process should be available to parents in the same way that it is for almost every other public service in this country. So I think perhaps there's been a confusion that we are trying to roll back reforms in education and reassert some sort of local government control. Actually, this has got nothing to do with local government. It's got to do with parents and pupils being able to speak up about problems that they've got with education provision.
I mean, very, very comprehensive answer. I just want to touch on one thing. You talked about, obviously, the growth of multi-academy trusts. And I'm sure you're aware that many multi-academy trusts don't have a governing body, and there's a lack of accountability, and there's a deficit of accountability, as you raised there. So could the Ombudsman help with that deficit of accountability on a local level?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of our key arguments. We think that actually in terms of having public trust in those academies, one of the best ways to do that is to enable people, when they've got a complaint that they haven't satisfactorily been able to resolve with the body itself, in almost every other walk of life, you can raise that with an independent body so that you can get a final answer that's been looked at impartially from the body. So we think we could actually help those academies by giving that level of independent scrutiny. It would help increase parents' trust, pupils' trust, and public trust in that system. It also would help learning. You know, one of the main things I'm committed to in our work is that, you know, you can learn from complaints to improve services. Academies are missing out on that by not being part of that kind of culture.
Yeah, really good answer. So go to the second part of the question. So the chair of this committee wrote to the Department of Education in April 2019 about this issue, and was told by the then Minister for School Standards, Nick Gibb, that there are other bodies that can handle the areas of education which you wish to oversee, namely the Schools Complaint Unit and the Education and Skills Fund Agency. So just, you've probably touched on it, just to outline a little bit more and drill into it. Why would the Ombudsman be a better organisation to handle complaints than those organisations?
I think there's a couple of problems with the current landscape. One of them is that, you know, if you look at the role of the Education Skills Funding Agency in relation to school admissions, if you're a parent who's applied to have your child go to, you know, a normal state maintained school, perhaps a faith school, and an academy, you can come to us about the faith school and the maintained school, but you can't come about the academy. So partly it's not necessarily criticism of the Education Fund and Skills Agency, it's just that why do you need two bodies doing exactly the same job? It's totally confusing for the public. And the other problem, though, with that agency, but also with the schools complaints function that sits within DFA, is they're not independent of government. I mean, the whole essence of an ombudsman scheme is that it's independent and impartial. And for people to have trust in that and to respect our decisions, they need to know that it's not being done by a government department who might be perceived to have skin in the game. It's got to be done by somebody who's absolutely impartial and separate from the delivery of that function. So, I mean, for me, it's all about independence, it's about impartiality, and it's about having that sense of public confidence in a system where people can turn and get an independent view of what's gone on.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, moving on now to the issues of adult social care. Andrew Lower. Andrew.
Thank you, Chairman. So you've called for the local government and social care ombudsman to be given jurisdiction over private adult social care providers who aren't registered with the CQC, the Care Quality Commission. What's your reasoning for seeking that?
Well, about 10 years ago, we were given jurisdiction. We used to, for most of our 50 years, we've been able to look at social care delivered by local authorities or commissioned by local authorities. 10 years plus ago, it was realised that actually lots of people who self-funded their own care didn't have the same rights to complain. So actually there was a very enlightened piece of legislation brought forward that enabled us to look at any complaint about social care in the public or private sector. So it's one of the most important parts of our jurisdiction, that there's this completely seamless joined-up process where if you move between being self-funded and maybe the local authority steps in to pay for your care, it doesn't matter. You can come to us and we can look at any aspect of that care. There are some gaps in that system, though, and that's for things like day centres, which don't have to be registered with CQC, but are an important part of people's experience of care. So part of what we're proposing is that those parts of the care system which are important to people but lie outside of CQC's registration, we should be able to look at those as well as looking at everything else in care. We can already look at 99% of what's within both the public and private care system. There are just some gaps which it doesn't make sense for them to be outside of our remit.
But you've already said in the earlier evidence that you've given that your resources are very stretched. So, given that it's likely that your resources will be continued to be stretched, and let's say that the quite substantial funding increase you're seeking isn't forthcoming, would you still seek to extend your remit that way, or would you worry that if you extend your remit without funding, some of the things you currently cover would not be covered properly?
It's a great point. I mean, I don't think there's any scope for us to be able to significantly increase the matters we deal with on our current funding basis. I mean, it just simply isn't possible. So any of the changes which we're proposing would need to be properly funded. Having said that, though, the cost, if you look at the overall cost of trying to improve aspects of the social care system, the cost of dealing with complaints is a very, very small part of that. And we think that the value added from being able to look at these things far outweighs the cost of delivering them. And it's interesting that I saw a presentation by a local authority recently who were talking about their learning from a complaint, an adult social care complaint, that where we'd upheld the complaint, they'd then used that as a learning tool within the organisation. One of the key conclusions that they came to is actually they could have saved a substantial amount of money had they dealt with that complaint upstream properly. They could have saved a huge amount of staff time and money that was incurred by the problems that came out subsequently. So I do genuinely believe that actually that you can invest to save by dealing with complaints properly. And certainly in the social care sector, not only is this a public service, but it's also a private market. And I used to work in consumer protection in the private sector. And one of the ways to increase the competitiveness and the health of any market is to make sure that you've got empowered, knowledgeable consumers. So actually, this isn't just simply about a regulatory lens on social care. I think actually we can invigorate and improve social care competitiveness in care markets through making sure that you've got that public transparency and public accountability.
Picking that theme up about accountability and budget pressures, in your written evidence to the inquiry that we're doing on adult social care, you acknowledge that adult social care providers are under huge financial pressures at the moment, but just to quote you directly here, we cannot make concessions for failures attributed to budget pressures. We must continue to judge authorities in line with relevant legislation, standards and guidance and their own policies. Would you have any concerns that not matching budgetary realities with the regulatory expectations may make you look detached from the realities at the present time?
So my view on this is very straightforward, which is that it's for Parliament to decide what the legislative expectations are of local authorities. It's not for me to set those aside because a local authority says that it doesn't have enough money. I'm a bureaucrat who's been appointed to do a particular job. I work within the framework that's set by Parliament and set by government. And for me to arbitrarily disapply Parliament's intentions, say in relation to the Care Act, I think would be massively overstepping my role. So I'm hugely sympathetic and aware of the kind of pressures that local authorities work under. But I've said to them absolutely clearly, I will continue to hold them to account against the standards which have been set by Parliament and the guidance which has been given to them by government, and also by the policies that they've agreed themselves through their own democratic processes. So it's not for me to trample on the sovereignty of Parliament or the sovereignty of local democracy. My role is to hold them to account against those standards which have been set through proper democratic processes.
Just to round off the different sorts of provision and different sorts of adult care people receive, in your triennial review you argued that the reason that you have fewer complaints from self-funders within adult care is that private providers do not sufficiently publicise the Ombudsman's services. I'm interested to know what evidence you have that this alleged lack of awareness about the Ombudsman is among self-funders is the cause of that, rather than a difference in the experiences that they receive as a result of being self-funders.
Well, one of the there's a clear statistical basis for that conclusion, which is that if you look at the proportion of people who are funded by local authorities, and you look at the proportion of people who are funded by self-funders, the proportion that come to us from local authority services, where they're signposted to us by the council, it's significantly higher proportionally than the number of people who are using self-funded services. Now, I guess the counter-argument could be, well, maybe self-funded services are so much better that people don't want to complain about them. But the flaw in that argument is a huge number of the people who are using self-funded services are in exactly the same establishments as people who are funded by the council. Often you've got a self-funded care user sitting in a chair alongside somebody who's funded by the council. So I just don't get that it could be about a different level of care being provided, in that lots of the care is being provided by exactly the same care providers. What we also know, though, is we talk a lot to the sector. We talk to sector leaders in the social care market. And what we know is that many social care providers take this very seriously, and they do it very well. But those same people who are taking complaints seriously, they tell us there are lots of other people in the market who... That's why we are calling for mandatory signposting by care providers, is that we think it creates a competitive disadvantage for those people who are actually doing this properly. So you've got responsible care providers who are taking complaints seriously, who are holding themselves up to scrutiny, and who are trying to learn from that. You've got other people who are completely ignoring that and potentially undermining the work being done by the more responsible care providers. So there's something here about equity in the marketplace, that actually if some people are allowed to ignore complaints, then actually I think that creates an unfair competitive advantage and a perverse incentive not to listen to the public. So I think it's really important that we should have much clearer expectations around complaint handling, which apply statutorily across the social care sector.
Okay, and just final thing, Chairman, if you don't mind. So just on this overall budget point then, if you don't get the budget increase that you want, and that's life for all of us really, would your preference be to focus in on a fewer areas of remit and do it at a higher degree of excellence, or broaden or seek to broaden out your remit so that at least there's some coverage of the areas that you've underlined that you have concerns about?
It's a very timely question, because we were already facing that challenge. I spoke a little bit earlier about the measures we'd had to put in place in order to deal with current backlogs and current pressures in terms of our work coming in. What we've had to do recently, and what we had to do 10 years ago when we first had significant cuts in our budget, we introduced what's called an assessment code. And what that code sets out is the criteria that we'll apply in deciding which complaints we will investigate, which we won't. So we already have to make those decisions day to day. And one of the things we decided to do over the summer was we actually had to tighten up that code further and focus more on those complaints which have got the greatest public value, which means that unfortunately there's some complaints that we perhaps would have looked at 10 years ago, which we can't now. So I suppose the answer to your question is we'd rather look at making sure we focus on those complaints that have the greatest power to improve services, those complaints which have the greatest public interest and have the greatest ability to perhaps lead to wider changes for more people, rather than just trying to do huge volumes of low-level transactional complaints. But yeah, it's a day-to-day reality for us and for most ombudsman schemes that we have to make those tough decisions at the start about what we will and what we won't look at.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Moving on to your remit with regard to councillors and councillors. Florence Shalomi.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. In your evidence to our devolution inquiry and in your 2018 and 2021 Triennial review, you called for the LGSCO to have oversight over large and parish councils, and you've touched on some of this in terms of devolution earlier, particularly where obviously those devolved powers were exercised by unitary authorities. How would you envisage that this oversight would work?
Well, the issue with town and parish councils, interestingly, back in 2015, the government launched a consultation to take views on whether we should have jurisdiction for larger town and parish councils. Since then, some of the larger town and parish councils have taken on even more duties, either working on behalf of principal authorities or delivering services in their own right. And obviously, as we've seen the unitarisation of some areas, actually we've seen new large town and parish councils created. So our view is that there's probably somewhere around 100 town and parish councils in this country, which are actually, in terms of the scale of their operations, they've got budgets and numbers of staff that are comparable to some of the smaller district councils that are already in our jurisdiction. We also think that actually town and parish councils are a really important part of service delivery. They're a really important part of local democracy. And sometimes they're the part of local government that actually is most familiar to people on the ground. So actually it's partly, we respect the professionalism and the importance of that tier of local government. So what we're proposing, and this is something that's supported by the National Association of Local Councils, is that what we should do is try and establish a pilot exercise where perhaps, and again this would need to be funded, but working with the National Association of Local Councils and perhaps some of the larger town councils who'd like to test this model, we'd like to run a pilot where we explore how it would be practical to bring some of those larger bodies within our jurisdiction in the same way that smaller district councils who do a similar role are already within our remit. And it's something that's got wide support amongst town and parish councils. So I'm very optimistic that's something which could be done both on quite a practical and pragmatic level to make that work.
Yeah, and you cite that wide support from National Association of Local Councils, and one of the things we saw in your submission was advocating for including your role over public transport bodies, including, for example, Mersey Travel. Is there a slight danger that you might be encroaching on areas and remits which, in a sense, haven't got any connection with local government, and would you be overstretching?
It's a good point. But I mean, in relation to issues around, say, strategic transport, that touches on a wider issue that's in our Triennial review. When we were first set up in 1974, obviously local government was a very different beast back then. Where local authority was very easily recognisable. It delivered most things itself. They had their name on the side of the van that was outside your house. Local government was a much simpler structure. What we've seen in the subsequent 50 years is all sorts of developments in terms of the way in which local authority works. Our concern isn't that we want to overreach and overstretch into new areas. Our concern is that over the years there's been piecemeal amendment of our legislation which hasn't actually reflected and kept up with the realities of the way in which local governments change. So this isn't so much about us trying to expand, it's just about us trying to do the job that we were always intended to do. So using your example around transport, if you look at combined authorities in this country, combined authorities are absolutely within our jurisdiction already, but it's quite clear that the public and some combined authorities don't realise that. Now, that's entirely forgivable because the way in which they've been brought into our jurisdiction is a minor amendment in a piece of 1974 legislation that I'm sure most people don't get out of bed and read every morning. We did a piece of research back in 2020 to see whether combined authorities actually understood that they were in our jurisdiction. What we found is there's a whole range of combined authorities who had absolutely no public complaints process on their website and failed to mention at all that you could raise your complaint with us. A colleague of mine checked on this last week, actually, and what he found is that's still the case. There's a very patchy understanding amongst combined authorities about where they sit. So if you take two combined authorities that are right next to each other, Greater Manchester and Liverpool, if you look on Greater Manchester's website, they've got a very good, very clear complaints process which tells you how you can complain about the combined authorities' functions. That then refers you, if you're not satisfied, to be able to come to LGSCO. So Greater Manchester doing it absolutely correctly. You look just over the road in Liverpool, you look on their website, there is no obvious complaints process for the public to follow if they've got a concern about the combined authority. And despite them being in our jurisdiction legally, there's absolutely no reference to us. The upshot of that is we get complaints about Greater Manchester services. We get no complaints whatsoever about Combined Authority services in Liverpool because there is no process for people to follow. So what you've got is people being disenfranchised by a lack of understanding and a lack of direction in the process. And that applies equally to things like transport. Transport for London is very clearly in our jurisdiction. That's written into our legislation. But if you look at transport delivered within, say, Greater Manchester, you would have to get a lawyer to try and decipher whether or not trams and buses are actually within our jurisdiction or not. So this is absolutely not about us trying to expand. This is about us trying to clarify a set of jurisdictions which have been in place for a long, long time. And our proposal is a very simple one. We need to wipe away 50 years of piecemeal amendments. We need to simply replace it with a universal statement to say that all forms of local government and everything delivered by local government is within our jurisdiction, and that people can raise a complaint about that unless it's specifically excluded. We think by just simplifying the entire process, that would be better for us to do our job. It'd be much clearer for the public to know what their rights are, and actually it'd be much better for local government in all its forms, because they wouldn't have to get a lawyer every time they want to know where they sat in terms of the complaints process. Yep. So our argument's one for simplification, not for expansion in that area.
No. And in that respect, it sounds clear. And obviously you touched on it a bit. One of the things that comes up from time to time in the news is committee and public life proposals in regard to elected representatives. And you've made an appeal that the decision making against councillors and sanctions of local councils who've breached a code of conduct. This would also see an extension of that power that you're seeking and will deal with the process of decision-making which councillors have. Could you just outline why you think it's important for you to have those additional powers and if there would be any consequences if you didn't have that?
Absolutely. We're very much in that. In this regard, we're responding to an agenda that's been set by the Committee on Standards and Public Life, as you say. 2 years ago, they published a report which said that there should be reforms to the ethical standards regime for local councillors. And that's in response to concerns that have been raised by a number of different bodies in the sector. What the Committee on Standards and Public Life recommended was that we should have a role that where a local process has decided a council was at fault and that they were suspended or they had some sanction imposed on them, the councillor would be able to come to us so that we could review whether the local process happened properly. That's a role which we absolutely stand ready to deliver, should the government wish to implement those recommendations. But we've gone one step further because in conversation with people in the sector, what people have said to us is that not a bit one-sided, that where somebody's made a complaint about a councillor, the councillor's got a right of appeal to the Ombudsman, but the person who's made the complaint hasn't, if they've got a concern about the way the local process is run. So what we're saying is that absolutely we don't want to recreate the Standards Board, absolutely we don't want to usurp the role of the monitoring officer and of local standards committees in dealing locally with standards issues. We think absolutely they should be dealt at first instance by local processes. What we're saying though is where those local processes have failed to get a satisfactory resolution, we think we could perhaps provide a helpful role in giving that independent assessment of those complaints to make sure that the local processes happened properly, but also to give some finality to what we all know can be quite toxic, long-running disputes sometimes. So if the local authority was able, or the complainant or the councillor was able to take that outside the local process and bring it to us, we think we could probably give closure to some very long-running and damaging issues that occur in that standard space. So effectively what we're saying is we think we can help. Whatever we do, though, we're not trying to do something separate from the Committee on Standards to Public Life's recommendations. What we're trying to do is advise on how we think we could help if there are changes to be made around council conduct complaints.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Moving on to the whole issue and possibilities of a public service ombudsman. Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Chair. You've called for the introduction of a single ombudsman. And I think in the Triennial review, in your forward, you confirmed that view. Later on in the Triennial review, you welcome the fact that the government's given clarity that it's not going to do that, which is somewhat confusing. if you're a betting man, what do you think the chances are of a single ombudsman being introduced?
Well, I suppose I should first of all clarify what appears to be a apparent contradiction. We for a long time, we've been on the record to say that we think that, in common with Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, there should probably be a single public services ombudsman in England. And that's particularly around health and social care, that we work very closely with our colleagues in the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman to make sure we try and join up complaints about that. But there's a myriad of examples where people's complaints cross over the jurisdiction of different ombudsmen. So in principle, we still believe that it would be better to have a single public service ombudsman, and certainly that model's been tested and proven to work well in the rest of the UK. The government brought forward a draft bill in 2016 to propose exactly those kind of changes. It didn't progress, though, due to obviously a whole range of other pressures in Parliament that have been in the intervening period. So we were left in a position where effectively we were in limbo, wondering whether or not that was going to progress. So we welcome the fact that the government has now confirmed that it's not going ahead, not because we don't want it to go ahead, but because if it isn't, we'd rather know, and then we can proceed as we are. So that's the reason why you've got those two positions there. So we still stand ready to engage in a debate about the creation of a single public service ombudsman. What we've tried to do in our triennial review this time, though, is just be realistic. If that isn't something that's going to happen in the near future, what are the kind of sensible, pragmatic, deliverable changes that could be made in our existing jurisdiction to try and bring that up to date, so that as long as we carry on as a separate entity, we're doing that in a way where we can meet contemporary expectations and modern standards. So our triennial review isn't a replacement for the idea of a public service ombudsman. What it's saying is it appears that in the next 3 years that isn't going to happen. So let's make the pragmatic and deliverable changes we need to make in the meantime.
Okay. One of the arguments that's given about keeping the various different, whatever the plural of ombudsman is, separate, is of course that allows the ombudsman to have expertise in particular areas. And indeed, you've already, I think, alluded to the fact that you've got a lot of staff that are getting on work coming in, and you don't have as much resource as you would like. So clearly, one argument here is that actually it's better off keeping those centres of expertise so that it can actually investigate the items that are relevant to your particular area of speciality. Do you agree with that view, or do you think it would be better to combine all these three ombudsmen together and then specialise within the one department or one operation?
I think there's respectable arguments to be made in both directions. Clearly there's a model which has developed in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland where you've got a single ombudsman, and that's been proven to work. I guess the challenge to that would be, though, the scale of operations and the size of the population in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland is fundamentally different to the case in England. So, this is a question that occupies there's a whole range of academics who study the ombudsman sector, and these issues are endlessly debated about whether actually sector-specific ombudsmen are more effective or whether a joined-up ombudsman. I suppose where we've always started in that debate is really trying to look at it from the perspective of the everyday citizen. And if you've got a complaint about social care, that probably was going to stray into a complaint about health. It might stray into a complaint about social housing provision. It might stray into a complaint about benefits. So often when we're looking at a complaint, we find that the interconnection between different areas of public life is very, very strong. And people are understandably confused when we say to them, well, we can look at this part of your complaint, but we can't look at that part. Obviously, in the meantime, what we try and do is work very closely both with the Housing Ombudsman, with the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman, to make sure that really wherever people come into the system, there's no wrong door. So if somebody comes to us and the complaint's really for the Housing Ombudsman, we'll make sure that we take that and signpost it to the Housing Ombudsman. If the complaint spans social care and health, we've got a joint team which we operate with the Parliamentary Ombudsman, so that we'll look at that as a joined-up approach. So in the meantime, while we've got three different ombudsmen, we all work very hard behind the scenes to try and make sure that the complexity sits behind the screen, and we deal with that. We try and make it as simple and as accessible as we can for the public.
Okay, the final bit I just want to cover, which is access, and I think the Chair is going to cover that. Mary's going to cover that in a few seconds. One of the issues of concern is obviously a lot of the complaints come via MPs, and an MP will try and look into the complaint before sending it on to the Ombudsman as best they can. There had been suggestions of taking that away and doing direct access. Do you think that's a good idea?
There's two different schemes in the UK, in England at the moment. One is, if you want to make a complaint to me, you can come direct. When we were first set up in 1974, you had to go by your local councillor, so there was what was called the councillor filter. So you could only complain by the councillor. That was taken away in the 1980s. And it's never caused us any problem. Having said that, I really welcome the role of councillors and MPs in acting as advocates and representatives for constituents who've got a problem. So I think there's a really healthy and important role for elected representatives as part of the complaints process, and I really welcome that. But there's no statutory requirement to go to your MP or your council before you come to us. That's slightly different for the parliamentary ombudsman, where you can only make a complaint about a central government function through your MP. And I don't want to speak on behalf of my colleagues in Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman, but I know they are on the record for many, many years to say that they think that whilst totally respecting the role of MPs in the complaints process, they're concerned that might act as a barrier for some people to make a complaint because they perceive that to be an additional hurdle. So I think there is a strong argument to say that people should have direct access to an ombudsman scheme without in any way diminishing the importance of the role of MPs and councillors. I think the general expectation in most ombudsman schemes is you'd be able to come direct if you wish to do so.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Moving on finally to the accountability of your service. Mary Robinson. Mary.
Thank you. In your 2018 Triennial review, you expressed a wish to be directly accountable to Parliament rather than a government department. And in 2019, you told us that other ombudsmen elsewhere in the UK and the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman report directly to Parliament and voice your concern that the public may perceive that you're not independent of government. What steps would you want to take to make the Ombudsman more accountable to Parliament?
Thanks for the question. I should first of all preface anything I say by saying that this isn't because I have a problem with our relationship with the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities. We actually enjoy a very constructive and positive working relationship, and they are always at pains to respect our independence. So I think we both recognise that the relationship of an independent ombudsman through sponsorship by a government department is a slightly odd one for both parties, but we both endeavour to make that work in the most professional way and the most constitutionally correct way possible. I think our argument, though, is that it creates a perception potentially in the minds of the public that we are part of the department that oversees local government, and I think it's that perception that concerns me. I think the other aspect of it, which is important, is the funding for an ombudsman scheme, which we've touched on a couple of times in this session. It should be determined independently of the kind of pressures on the sector in which you operate. I think the reality of our funding is, rather than it being determined on the resources needed to run the ombudsman scheme, it has inevitably been reflected the pressures on what used to be the Department of Communities and Local Government. And as they have had to make savings in the local government budget, some of those savings have been passported to us. So we've seen a consistent and catastrophic decline in our capacity and our resources, driven largely by our association with local government, rather than having an independent assessment of what resources we need if, for example, we made that submission to Treasury. So if you look at the way in which Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsmen are funded, who talk directly to Treasury, they've been given significant resources and necessary resources by Treasury in order to deal with pressures of COVID, in order to deliver the ambitions set out in their next 3-year plan. And I sit on their board and can absolutely say that those resources are appropriate. We have no way of making that kind of case other than through our sponsor department, who inevitably have their hands tied because they're delivering a budget associated with the administration of a local government. So the independence point is an important one, both in terms of public perception, but also in terms of the way in which we're resourced and the way in which we're run.
Do you have a greater expectation that you may receive a bigger budget if you're going directly to Treasury rather than through a department?
I think certainly that's been the case in practice between, if you look at the way in which the funding between ourselves and Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman has diverged considerably over the last 15 years. We used to be funded on a very similar level. I think Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman probably gets around 3 times the budget that we do now. And as I say, that isn't an argument to say that that's inappropriate. Absolutely not. As I say, I sit on their board and wholly endorse the proposals that they've made. I think the problem is more with us. I think we've become something of an outlier because we're anchored to local government budgets. The practical reality has been our resources have declined accordingly.
Thank you. In 2019, you also voiced concern that the scope of the Ombudsman was far wider than your sponsoring department, which is now Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities. You also want to, as we've heard today, expand your remit further. So how should your relationship then with government change to reflect those concerns and ambitions if you're seeking to work across some quite different areas?
Well, already in our work, we cover jurisdictions which are directly relevant both to Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities, but also Department of Health and Social Care. A significant part of our work relates to that. 1/3 of our complaints are about adult social care or about children's services. So a significant part of our work relates to Department for Education and Department of Health and Social Care. But also, we regularly talk to people like the Ministry of Defence around complaints relating to the Armed Forces Covenant. We talk to people like BAYS around the Regulators Code. So our work truly does extend right across most sectors of government. And I think that's another argument for why that accountability would more appropriately be directly to Parliament and be independent of any particular sponsor department. And I say the model already exists for that with our colleagues in the Parliament and Health Service Ombudsman who don't have a sponsor department. They relate through the Cabinet Office to government, but in terms of funding and accountability, they relate to Parliament through PACAC.
Given the changes to the Department for Health and Social Care, have you been given any indication that they may be seeking to take anything from your remit?
I'm not aware of anything being taken from our remit, but certainly we've been in discussions with the department to suggest ways in which we might be able to support efforts to improve the social care system. And we've made about 7 proposals in our triennial review for practical things we could contribute to improving the way in which the social care system is accountable to the people who use it.
Is there an argument for integration of the different ombudsmen dealing with these cross-departmental issues?
Absolutely, yes. It goes back to the question that was asked a little bit earlier on about the creation of a single public services ombudsman. The interconnectivity between a lot of these issues is very strong. And as I say, we've been on record for many years saying that one of the answers to that might be to create a new body, a public services ombudsman, which can look at those complaints right across the piece rather than them to be looked at in silos in each different sector.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. I think that comes to the end of quite a comprehensive round of questions about your functions as they are and how they might be improved or reformed for the future. So, Mick, thank you very much indeed for coming and answering those questions today. Pleased to hear that you haven't got COVID after all. You had a little scare. But nevertheless, thanks very much for coming. And I'm sure there are a lot of issues there, some of which the committee has looked at before and come to views about. Others are newer on our agenda, and I think we'll have a think about those and perhaps come forward with some proposals of our own about how things might be taken forward. But thank you very much, and that brings us to the end of our public proceedings for today. Order, order.